This is Russ Peery, 93, being well cared for, having memories stirred up about the civil rights movement. I would say, even though my focus will be on Middletown, I must note that in 1946, when I was still in the service, President Truman desegregated the black and white troops, so they were no longer separate. And knowing that he could do this influenced me later on in a subtle way, but I knew that pronouncements could be made and lives could be changed. So I moved to Middletown in 1958, and my time at being involved in the civil rights movement was about a decade. I came from 2 parishes to come to this little town that had a lot of blacks in it. And I immediately became aware of their presence, even though I had South Congregational Church. I was its pastor, but we did have a lot of Wesleyan University people who were interested in civil rights. And I was pretty much a liberal, and I took a hankering to listening to my Wesleyan colleagues. And I decided it would be appropriate for me to join the NAACP. And so I did. And I had some friends there, some black, some white. I got involved in caring for the housing of some of the poor black people. And I do recall one day working on the outside of a house. It was on a ladder, people walking by shouting, "Nigger lover, nigger lover." And that was the first time I heard that. And that phrase was used by many folks who didn't like what I was doing. But I kept on. I thought my preaching was fairly moderate, and we took into the church one black dentist. In those days, in the 1950s and 60s, they were not so much black, they were Negroes. And this young black dentist became a member of the church. I was fairly friendly with him. I was friendly with John McGuire and David Swift, who taught in the religion department and who were very interested in what I was doing. David and John joined the Freedom Riders. I think I'd been there a few years by then, and my testimony will not be very chronologically correct, but both of them went down south to protest at lunch counters. They got arrested, and I wanted to raise money to get them out of jail, but someone had already done that. Anyway, these two men from the faculty, plus really several others, there were more than a dozen faculty members from Wesleyan University. Wesley was very important in the moves that I made. And anyway, they came back. They got out of jail. They came back. Another thing that happened, I was pastor of one of the downtown churches. Early on, probably by 1960, the five pastors of the five churches became quite friendly, and we were all fairly liberal. I was perhaps the most. Joe Harvey from the Episcopal Church, Al Sharpton, I think, from the Methodist Church, Len Kohofer from the First Congregational Church, George Sinclair from the First Baptist Church. The five of us made up an aggregate that was effective in making some difference in the town of Middletown. At one point, and this is later on, when there was something called Tent City in Washington, D.C., which was for the hungry, and it was a gathering of many, many tents, many, many people proclaiming that hunger was bad. And the five of us drove down together to D.C. We didn't get in a tent, or we got in briefly and we looked at them, but we took a stance. And when we got back to our parishes were not pleased. I received 3 at least letters requesting my resignation. Fortunately, the strong people in the center of the church were able to keep me alive anyway. But it was a very moving time to be involved. Also, the ecumenical movement, which was catalyzed by Pope John the 23rd, enabled priests to be more free. And we all began to be friendly with each other, the priest and the Protestant pastors, and therefore we had a louder voice. One of the exciting times for me was when at Wesleyan University, John McGuire, who was a friend of Martin Luther King, arranged a small meeting with about a dozen people in a place I think called Downey House, which belonged to Wesleyan. And I went to that meeting and I met Martin Luther King, and Martin Luther King shook my hand. And what a thrill that was for me to have been touched by that great man. I do remember following him pretty blindly until he began to take on the Vietnam War and the fact that it was an illegal and not a right thing to do. And at first I thought, why in the world would Martin Luther King decide to take on another enemy? Couldn't he wait till the black problem was solved and then go to Vietnam? But no, he persisted, and I became a follower of his at that point, and I also took a stance on the Vietnam War. So I was the pastor who was teaching Jesus Christ at South Congregational Church and manifesting it in terms of helping to free up the Black community and hoping to stop the endless war over in Vietnam. I think that pretty much, no, it does not cover totally. Wesleyan started a group called Middletown Future, and it's probably the mid-60s while all this was going on. And there was a group of about a dozen or so people who gathered once a week to discuss the situation in Middletown. And we talked all over the place, but we had keen interest in the Black community, the Negro community. We had keen interest of that and in Middletown, and we also had keen interest in Vietnam. And I remember the Middletown manager, whose name at the moment I cannot remember. I still email to him, however, so I should remember it, but I don't. But he and I became quite friendly, and we worked together even outside of that committee, Middletown Future. And we did make some difference in our community. How much, of course, it's hard to measure. But what happened to me is that by the late 1960s, this was after Martin Luther King and Kennedy had been shot. I was riled by all of this, and certainly thought those assassinations terrible. By the same token, my own personal life was all askew. And in 1968, I began the process of getting divorced. And before the end of that century, I was divorced. I had a new job in Hartford, Connecticut, dealing with the elderly. And I totally changed my interest. So my involvement in the Middletown community's actions toward the Black folks and toward hunger lasted probably close to a decade. The 60s was my decade for that, and that ended. And later I did other things, but I'm here to testify about my involvement in civil rights while I was living in Middletown, and very friendly. Owen Kaplan, by the way, I got the name of the town city manager who moved out west to Hollywood. And we've stayed interested. So that's the story. Very heavy duty, wonderful, terrible decade. I was privileged to partake of it. And as I look back, I wonder why I didn't do more. But that's the story, my story. Yeah, I do want to make an end comment that I think my mother really hated segregation, didn't know much about it, didn't do much about it. My father was probably mildly into segregating, but my mother influenced me. And I think without her input, I never would have done the things I did. Thank you for letting me share and open memories up, some of which I had nearly forgotten, but obviously did not.